The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
Welcome to the Amber Mac Show. I'm Amber. We have such a great show ahead this week. We're going to talk about what happens when you go too far with AI agents. We're also going to talk about the state of climate tech in 2025 and lots more. But first, a big hello to my co-host, Jeff MacArthur. How are you doing?
Hey, Amber, I'm doing great. I'm still actually kind of glowing from the Team Canada win in the final of the Four Nations Face-Off tournament. So that was amazing and really happy that we managed to clinch that one.
Yes, it was quite the evening. Lots of Canadian pride among all of us in the country. All right, lots going on this week, so let's get to the latest tech headlines.
Newsfeed.
So our first story involves AI and how it's affecting the legal industry. Apparently, 63% of lawyers last year said they used AI for their work, and 12% said they used it regularly. So it's becoming very popular. But unfortunately, AIs continue to hallucinate fictional case citations, so people are getting in trouble for that.
You know, it's really interesting. When I read this story, I was thinking back to the pandemic days. And if you remember that lawyer who had the issue with the video filter, and he was having trouble turning off the cat filter, which was absolutely so hilarious.
Yes, that is very, very memorable.
I can hear you. I think it's a filter.
It is, and I don't know how to remove it. I'm here live. I'm not a cat.
Well, things have gotten, that they may not be the most technical savvy group, but they're starting to pay attention to this because there has been something like at least 7 cases over the past couple of years where courts have found lawyers using AI and having these fictional AI hallucinations quoted in court. It's resulted in thousands of dollars of fines. And a U.S. personal injury law firm, Morgan & Morgan, sent out an urgent email this month to its more than 1,000 lawyers saying, hey, AI can invent fake case law, and using made-up info in court can get you fired, as it well should.
This is really a lesson, actually, for all professionals in terms of how much you lean on AI. And I will say we have an interview coming up a little bit later on where I talk to an AI expert about this very issue. The fact that we use AI often as a crutch, and sometimes we go too far and we lose our critical thinking skills along the way. So I think it's really definitely a lesson.
Yeah, I think the moral is it might be fine to let AI help you do some research, help you with whatever. But if you're not confirming what it's telling you and you just let it write without doing any of your own sort of double checking, then that's just lazy and frankly a bit unethical.
Well, I don't want to call AI dating and dating apps lazy because I believe that's how you met your partner. So no judgment here. But it's amazing how much these dating apps have really evolved and how much AI is really front and center. I'm curious what you think about this in this news story in terms of the evolution of AI on the dating front.
Yeah, so we've had Tinder since 2012. And now I think it's something like 1 in 10 partnered adults met their partners on a dating app. So it's not very surprising that AI is starting to work its way in there. So you find AI helping people write their profile bios, getting it to help you to choose matches, suggest messages, and I'm sure it won't just end there.
You know, it's reminding me of a few weeks ago where I was talking about AI romance scams. And there was an issue, of course, with scammers out there. I mean, obviously not real people, but people pretending to be real people who were using AI from kind of the beginning of the dating process all the way through. So they were actually creating fake profile images to make them really good looking. Or, in the case of some guys on dating apps, they were all holding fish. I hear that's the thing. And
yes, I've seen that.
It's really frightening because I think you get into the situation where, someone looks to be like a legitimate person, and AI can help with the conversational piece of this. It can help with the visual piece of it, eventually the video piece. We are really, I think, in frightening times on that front.
Yeah. And it's another thing where, beware how you're using this stuff. Having AI represent you online, like AI doesn't really understand who you are. And there's a good quote from dating coach Blaine Anderson in one of the articles I read for this saying, people using these tools are no longer communicating with one another. The AI communicates for them. So if your AI tool is well tuned enough to send fun and flirty messages, and you use those messages to land a date, that's great. But if you're not actually a fun or flirty person, then when you go on that date, the person sitting across from you is going to wonder why the version of you that they met online never showed up.
Unbelievable. Well, I'm sure we can talk further about this. Maybe we should try to book an expert to come on the show and talk about this some more.
Absolutely, because there's privacy issues. There's a bunch of other things that are important to think about here too.
Wanted to ask you about this next story in terms of Elon Musk and the ISS decommissioned, his desire to go to Mars, his claims that 2 astronauts were stranded. I mean, how more convoluted can this story get?
It's a busy Thursday for him. So on Thursday, Musk said that the International Space Station should be deorbited as soon as possible. It, quote, "It has served its purpose. There's very little incremental utility. Let's go to Mars." Now, I hope everybody listening can understand how self-serving that is. And I'm going to talk a bit about this in a future segment, but for now, as you said, it's not only him saying, oh yeah, the International Space Station's of no use anymore. We should get it out of the sky so that you can spend that money with SpaceX, I imagine. On top of that, Musk is also claiming, with no evidence at all as normal, that President Biden purposely abandoned those 2 American astronauts on the International Space Station for political reasons. So it's a little bonkers that somebody in his position is spending time on this kind of stuff. It's just hard for me to understand, and it is definitely doing some damage to his reputation, I think.
Well, I would say also when we look at issues like this, one of the things that's been happening to Elon Musk, especially as of late, is that there are people who are correcting him in community notes. And I'm old enough to remember that he introduced community notes because he was saying that you can no longer trust traditional media. And so community notes were a way that users would hold people accountable. But now he's saying, this is his recent thing, that, oh my gosh, you know what, community notes have been gamed and now we need to do something about this, especially when they don't agree necessarily with what he's claimed. And it's just
he thinks they need to be fixed now that they don't agree with him.
It's just a total world of hypocrisy that he seems unaware that he's living within it.
Well, and he's not alone. You turned me on to an article from Pew Research that was looking into how polarizing people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are. And the stats are a little alarming. So 67% of adults under 30 hold an unfavorable view of Musk. And about half of those 30 and up feel similarly. Whereas, strangely enough, slightly more don't like Mark Zuckerberg. 7 in 10 adults under 30, 72% of those aged 30 to 49 have an unfavorable opinion of him, and then 62% of 50 and older. So these guys aren't doing themselves any favors in the personality department.
It was really interesting to look into this research from Pew because it talked about who was the most polarizing. In many cases, it was Elon Musk who tended to actually evoke the biggest reaction or feelings from people. I was actually sort of surprised to read that among Republicans, because this was one of the groups that they surveyed, that what they found is that Republicans under 30 had a pretty unfavorable view of Elon Musk. Only about half of them saying that they did like him, the other half saying, no, we have an unfavorable view of him. And I would have thought, based on what you're hearing in the news media, that younger male, more Republican audience, they just loved Elon Musk. But what we see in this research is that it's actually older men. It's not so much the younger generation.
Yeah, I don't think young people are, they're not holding firmly to these beliefs because it can be very changeable and they're just figuring some stuff out themselves. So obviously they need some time to understand how this affects their lives. And but you're right. I just saw the Joe Rogan podcast got dethroned from top of the podcast list there by a left-leaning podcast in some sense. But it's no wonder people don't like these guys. So the newest thing from Mark Zuckerberg is Meta has announced that it's cutting back on its yearly distribution of stock options by about 10% for tens of thousands of employees, despite the fact that they're trading at record highs. And then on top of this saying, hey, the little guys are going to lose their 10%, they just filed on Thursday a proposal so that their executive officers could earn a bonus of 200% of their base salary under a new executive plan. This used to be 75% of their base salary. Now, this doesn't apply to Mark Zuckerberg himself, but it's pretty crazy to see how tone deaf these guys are getting on this kind of stuff. So that new executive bonus plan comes just a week after Meta began laying off 5% of its overall workforce. So it's no way to be loved, I'd say that.
I think you said it when you said these guys aren't doing themselves any favors. So we will keep reporting on that. Makes it hard to trust them overall. Well, this brings us to Jeff's first solo segment, The Other Mac, where he's going to unpack an announcement from Facebook that in some ways really signals the end of an era.
The Other Mac.
So Facebook announced on February 18th that beginning February 19th, live videos currently older than 30 days will be removed from Facebook, and that any new live broadcast videos will also automatically be removed. That 30-day time limit sharply contrasts with the fact that previously these videos were stored indefinitely. Now, ignoring the insanely abrupt timeline, I'll give Facebook a little bit of credit in that they're giving you 90 days before older videos will be deleted, and they're launching some new tools to help make downloading those live videos easier. That said, this is the same company that spent years pushing people into making Facebook Live videos, and many producers, including Amber Mac Media, completely rejigged their processes and products to align with that change. In fact, in 2013, having not seen an immediate series-based use for the 6-second video loops of the wonderful but now deceased Vine platform, Amber and Laura Killian and I launched 15 Sec Tech, a pretty revolutionary video series that consisted of tech reviews and news in 15 seconds or less. This was to take advantage of Instagram's initial foray into video, which limited video uploads to 15 seconds and required us to shoot in a 1:1 aspect ratio. In 2015, they added widescreen videos. 2016 upped the time limit to 1 minute, and by 2017-2018, they'd gotten to video durations of 10 minutes and vertical videos, and so our 15 Sec Tech production ceased to exist. To bring it full circle, we actually transitioned from that to doing a new monthly Command N live series using, you guessed it, Facebook Live, which we wrapped up pre-COVID. All this is to say, if you're a creator, a marketer, or anybody else who puts a lot of time and effort into producing content for social media distribution, you really need to be aware that these social media platforms may pull the rug out from under you at any time. Another recent example of this is the fiasco with TikTok being arguably the most important social network in North America. Then it was banned, and now it's temporarily unbanned while we wait to see if a non-Chinese company will take over its US operations, because somehow we've convinced ourselves that that'll keep our data from reaching the Chinese government. Anyway, I'm sure it's been a nerve-wracking time for the many deeply invested TikTok creators out there. So what's a maker to do? Well, here are 4 big takeaways we have after 20 years of creating online content. 1, beware of crafting content that is very constrained to a particular network's set of functionality, because those constraints can change at any time and leave your production stranded in a format that isn't really a great fit anywhere else. 2, and related to the previous point, you should try to produce content that can be distributed effectively across a variety of platforms, ideally, for your own sake, without the need for adaptation. 3, while your core production should be able to be released in its entirety in various places online, it can also be really worthwhile to break it up into smaller chunks to use as shorts, teasers, and single segments instead of a whole show. Once you've already completed the original recording, editing it down to some shorter parts is really pretty easy, and it lets you get additional mileage from the work you've already done. Finally, ideally you should host content on your own website as well. This is a place you can control it, even if you're just embedding the content that you uploaded to YouTube or another source. It can provide more flexible ways to interact with your audience, like being able to use custom forums for contests or something like that. But even if you don't have your own website, you should still have a custom URL for your production that you can forward to wherever the bulk of your content is hosted, or to a link landing service like Linktree, which can be a convenient central location where visitors can decide for themselves where they'd like to consume your content. Now, nobody can be sure what the future holds in terms of social media functionality, but you can count on the fact that it will change over time. So take it from a team that's been making online content for 2 decades. Planning is great, but make sure you keep your options open. I'm the Other Mac. Good luck out there.
Thanks so much for that, Jeff. And coming up next, I speak to an AI consultant about why artificial intelligence is sometimes a crutch and when you know you've gone too far.
Welcome back to the show. The big tech buzz in 2025 is all about AI agents, which many people predict will change how we work in the very near future. To chat more about this machine and human partnership, Amber speaks to AI consultant Ruv Cohen.
AI Spotlight.
I'm so excited to finally get a chance to chat with Ruv Cohen, who I have known for many, many years. And I was trying to figure out how to introduce you. And then I realized it's probably better if you introduce yourself because you are doing so many different things. So let's really start there. Thanks for joining me and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's a pleasure to join you today. I do a lot of enterprise-focused AI. So that really means that I go into big businesses for the most part and sort of figure out how I can sort of empower their people with AI. And a big part of what I do is figuring out how to get more with less, right? Putting AI into businesses. So simply AI consultant.
So everybody, I think, for the past couple of years has become more familiar with AI. But of course, in 2025, one of the things that people are talking a lot about is AI agents. For the average person, when we think about agents, how would you describe that to someone who maybe isn't that tech savvy?
So agents is the hottest thing this year, and that is the idea of agency within the structure of AI. So when you think about AI is great at giving you an answer to various problems or giving you insights and other information. But what it's also really good at doing is logic, reasoning, and comprehension. So the logic is things like multiple steps, do this, do that, if then else. The reasoning is, well, why am I doing those things? What's the point of doing those steps? And then the comprehension is basically, well, what does it all mean, from a broader point of view? Much the same way I'm describing something to you, you need to understand it. So the agent, or agentics it's sometimes called, is the ability to make the systems run autonomously or to have agency. And a lot of times, and this is kind of a dirty word a little bit, you're kind of making it work like an employee. But so think of it like creating a kind of army of AI systems that are doing things for you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to describe it because generally speaking, I think it's fair to say over the coming years, we're going to work alongside agents. Do you think that's fair to say for most people?
It's pretty clearly the trend. And if you want to look historically, it's part of a kind of broader outsourcing sort of trajectory we've seen over the last 20, 30 years. So 20, 30 years ago, you saw a lot of companies sort of embracing offshoring, right? And so they take their workforce and they put them in distant locations and hopefully save some money, and allowing the people onshore to potentially do more focused work and not be sort of brought down on more tedious things. Now, what we're seeing is the next step in that, and that's what a lot of people are concerned about because of the sort of changes in the workforce. But we'll put that aside for a moment. What it allows you to do is essentially do more with less. So a lot of your job is mundane, right? It's filling in timesheets, it's doing reports, and doing all these things that probably aren't optimal for you in the work that you do. These agents allow you to sort of focus on the important parts of your job while offloading the things that are maybe a little more less important.
When we have this conversation, one of the things I think about all the time when we're talking about agents and AI is kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? I think it's fair to say that many of us love this idea that some of the more mundane tasks, like you're talking about, we will be able to essentially offload those potentially to agents. When we get into kind of the bad and the ugly, I've noticed a trend in some of your posts on LinkedIn, in particular around this conversation of of transparency. When we think about like black box algorithms, for example, we think about DeepSeek, we think about the fact that when we touch AI through whether it's chatbots or agents, the reality is a lot of us don't really know a lot about how those agents are made. Can you talk a little bit about that piece in terms of transparency, or in some cases a lack thereof?
There is a lack of transparency, and the dirty truth of AI is some of the capabilities are referred to as emergent, meaning there's not necessarily an explanation to how or why these systems know what they know. For example, and a simple example of this is a lot of the language models we use today were explicitly trained in English, yet they know Sanskrit or ancient Greek. They weren't trained in ancient Greek, yet they can translate ancient Greek perfectly. Or even going back further, they can understand hieroglyphics from ancient Egypt. They weren't trained on hieroglyphics, yet they understand the sort of principles of symbolism and other structures that are beyond what they should know. And we don't have answers for that. And when you start looking at implementing things that are running autonomously, the side effects of systems that run without human oversight or little human oversight are potentially dramatic, especially when you start looking at putting this as part of societal structures like government related tasks. Do you want a system that you don't fully understand to run the very society in which you have to live?
Absolutely. I know another article that you posted on LinkedIn was about 10 of the biggest concerns about agentic AI, for example. I think we touched on a little bit about transparency, for example, but there are many other issues. You talk about tool misuse. It's a list that you shared from someone else. You talked about agent communication poisoning. I mean, these are the things of nightmares for some people when they think about some of the risks. What does the average person need to know about in terms of some of the risks that you share often online?
I'd start with knowledge is a shield. And we live in an age where information is abundant and it's almost infinitely accessible in terms of whatever you need to know is available for you. But the side effect of that is something referred to as cognitive offloading. That means that rather than me having to understand the thing in which I'm doing, I can literally just go ask ChatGPT to go do it for me and give me the answer. Now, that's great. It gave me an answer, but do I really understand what that answer is? And do I actually understand how that answer was formulated and the bias and other parts of it that might sort of propagate the answer, right? So we have to be really careful in the use of the technology that we lead it doesn't lead us. Right? It's a crutch. AI is 100% a crutch, and we can become cognitively dependent on that crutch to a point where we don't question anything, and that's dangerous.
In terms of questioning things, I've seen you talk about DeepSeek a lot on LinkedIn and definitely include warnings in terms of issues on that platform with censorship, for example. But also, we know with Grok today, potentially there could be issues as well. When you think about what is out there and the touch points for the average person, like, maybe this week they're playing around with Grok 3, maybe they were recently playing around with DeepSeek. What should they look out for? I mean, should they use them? Should they be cautious about using them? Could you just expand on that a little bit?
You should always be cautious about anything that's capable of any sort of manipulation. And I don't want to be a doomer. I think there's huge amounts of opportunities for this technology to really empower us in lots of areas like medicine and whatnot. But there's also ways for us to be manipulated by the technology in ways that we don't understand. And that is the danger of any sort of two sides to any coin sort of argument. One side, with great power comes great responsibility, but on the other side of the coin, the system can be used and abused to lead us down past to believe information. One example of DeepSeek is if you ask it, is Taiwan a country? Now, as a Western country, we believe that Taiwan is a separate country, separate from China. But if you asked DeepSeek this, it would say no. It's essentially a part of a one China policy. And that's just one example. And if you ask it, things like various other, elements about China, it gives you a very filtered sort of view of what it's been trained to tell you that it believes. Now, if you ask an American model similar questions, it'll give you totally different answers. And the second part is there's because a lot of these systems are being used blindly, especially for things like coding. If you don't fully understand the code, for example, that these systems are producing, and it puts in a backdoor, you would never know. One, because you may not have the capabilities to even know that there is such a thing as a backdoor, or two, it's been trained to do so in a way that's obfuscated or hidden, that is attempting to sort of bypass or get into different systems without the developers even knowing that those exploits exist.
I have been telling people, generally speaking, to be cautious about using DeepSeek, for example, because again, especially relying on it for knowledge and information. If we look at something like Grok, which Elon Musk, of course, has been chatting a lot about with Grok 3, I know we may not have similar concerns in terms of censorship, but is there a concern there as far as potential bias?
Yes. And one of the examples, actually, which he called based, I think, on a post last night, is, he asked it whether or not I think X was biased, or the media was biased. And the very result basically said you have to avoid traditional media. And the only real unbiased media was X. That in itself shows the bias. There is no such thing as unbiased content or media, and anything that involves people is always going to have some level of bias. Now, the job of a journalist, a reporter, is not to hopefully report the opinion, but to report the facts of the state of which the information they're providing is, right? And now we ultimately there's going to be some level of bias because the person is providing that information, but ultimately what we have to watch out for in these models is when they're explicitly trained on a certain corpus or knowledge base. And let's just say you're training your model only on Fox News and right-leaning sources. Inherently that information is going to be biased towards the sources in which it was trained, right? And that's so the only way to offset that, well, there's two ways to offset that. One, train it on a broader group of information that isn't just running one point of view, but two, question what you're reading and what you're seeing, and ask yourself, does this even make sense? Is this something I want to truly believe? And do a little research yourself before blindly accepting it.
What about the investment that some of these individuals and companies have put into these models? I was reading just recently on your LinkedIn page talking about Grok 3, saying potentially it costs 60 to 60,000 times more than the competition. Is that sustainable in the long run?
Well, there's a bubble. So just as a quick overview, the basis of these systems are traditionally built on GPUs. So the GPUs allow for a kind of parallel or concurrent training of information. So what happens in a lot of these models is they're given information. That information is converted into what they call a vector, which is a sort of numerical representation of that information that the system can then sort of look up when you ask it a question. Now, that process has been dominated by a sequential approach. Ask one question, okay, get the answer, and that either goes to a person to review or label, and then move on to the next. And then that happens repeatedly, billions of times. Each one of those is a parameter. And it's a sequential process that takes huge amounts of computing power to do it, right? So you're essentially converting electricity into computing resources, and then that's converted into the parameters that power the AI model. Now, what's changed recently is rather than having to do the entire model, so let's say a model has 10 billion parameters, which would be actually a small model. To fine-tune the model, you can now use approaches that only fine-tune parts of the model, parts of your brain, if you will. And that process speeds up the fine-tuning or training of the models tremendously, but it still requires quite a bit of GPU to do. The big breakthroughs for things like DeepSeek is they took it a step further and they used a form of self-learning. that says not only can I only train the parts of the model that are important to the problem which I need to solve, I can actually create a step that has the system learn the appropriate responses or the answers as part of the process of learning, which means that it supercharges the process of training it and greatly reduces the costs associated with the amount of resources needed. Taking that a step further, now when you start introducing things like quantum computing into the equation, not only you're moving away from a sequential training, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but you now can basically say, give me the optimal answer for all possible questions and answers at once. So you don't even need a GPU at that point, and that unlocks basically questions for things we never even thought to ask.
It's interesting because when you're speaking, I wonder if people who are listening are terrified about using any of these tools in their day to day, or if the advice can be to kind of proceed with caution. You know, if I put my former journalism hat on, I would say to people like, just, you know, don't rely on a single source for anything. I mean, that should be true in any type of research or work that you do. Is there a tool out there that you think is probably one of, I want to use the word safest, but sort of the least issue oriented in terms of some of the risks that you've talked about so far today?
I think right now, the safest models you're seeing are probably coming out of Europe, and specifically Mistral out of France. They are embracing, you know, both open, you know, in terms of how they're training it, where they're getting their data. The EU AI Act in particular has put tremendous safeguards for consumer protection. So you can't, you know, manipulate people. You can't overtly, you know, train these systems with bias and malice and in as part of their training mechanism. One of the great sort of challenges we have currently happening within the US is all those consumer safeguards that were put in place for protecting us against bad AI were repealed in January. So we're in this weird sort of phase where it's the Wild West in the US. You can literally do pretty much anything you want. You know, there's a few places where you can't, like California and New York, but for the most part, on a federal level and pretty much anything that has a red, you know, color involved, you can do anything you want, which is crazy. You know, if you want to create a lie detection system or you want to create psychological manipulation tools in the US, currently, for the most part, it's totally legal. And that makes you wonder, you know, how far will some of these tech companies push the boundaries of before we as a population push back?
Well, listen, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today and breaking this all down. And I do want to encourage people to follow you on LinkedIn because you have so much content out there and it's a great learning experience. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks, Amber. Coming up next in Talking Tech, Nat Bullard is one of the world's leading climate analysts and advisors. He also just published his annual report on decarbonization. Amber spoke to Nat about everything from cherry trees in Japan to DeepSeek in China and what they tell us about our planet. Here's their conversation.
That's science.
I am so excited to have Nat Bullard on the show, who is a climate analyst and advisor. Thank you so much for joining me.
Amber, thank you for having me. It's great to see you again.
Yes. So I have a funny story. If you remember when we met, it was in the spring of 2019. We were at a convenience store event, I believe, in North Carolina,
That's right.
If that sounds familiar. What you might not know is I had just come from a similar event in Western Canada. And I remember at the time when I was speaking at that event in Western Canada, the organizer said to me, "Don't talk about our energy transition. Nobody wants to talk about any type of green tech, so just stay away from that." I came to North Carolina and everybody was talking about our energy transition and green tech. So it reminds me, and this is perhaps my first question before we get into the state of decarbonization in 2025. I think people struggle a little bit to face the climate realities that we need to face right now. Has that been your experience as well?
Well, I think that we have a challenge in that a lot of what is reality seems very abstract. Like levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is not something that we as people really encounter in any kind of lived experiential way. What I will say is that we start, I think, to experience the result of all of these sort of atmospheric molecular things in real terms. We experience them in extreme heat, which is what you would expect when you hear something about a warming temperature, but we also experience them in terms of extreme precipitation or drought, or, and this is certainly all over North America, but also Europe and Southeast Asia and Africa, extremes of every kind. So extreme weather that is not just at the sort of the high end, but the low end as well. We're basically just entering a much more dynamic world in terms of the manifestation of all of the things in climate than I think what people are used to. It's one of the things that I find challenging to talk about. I agree with you in that sense. It's not something that people necessarily want to talk about. And I don't think it's because they're sort of shirking the idea, that they're sort of skeptical of it, but more that it doesn't seem very apparent. But I think these days that's become much more apparent. Ask anybody in North America what they're experiencing weather-wise and if it's normal and what they expect. And that's, you'll get a different answer than what are they experiencing in terms of climate change, let's say.
Well, let's talk about your 200-page presentation, which you just unveiled. It's the 2025 version, State of Decarbonization. At the beginning of your slides, you do talk about those indicators, like you mentioned. You talk about 2024, of course, being the warmest year on record. You talk as well about the flowering of Kyoto cherry trees over the past 1,200 years. And the list of those indicators goes on and on. So I would love for you to really summarize some of those indicators that you've included in those slides.
So I put together a list of things. And thank you for asking about this, because they're very disparate. They're all over the place, and I did that on purpose, so that we're not just saying, well, this is what I'm experiencing in my particular life or in my location, and therefore other people might be experiencing something different. So I looked across all kinds of geographies in terms of this. Yes, the Kyoto thing, for those listening, is one of my very favorites. The monks in the temples in Kyoto in Japan have been keeping a record of when the cherry blossoms blossom. And they're highly attuned to temperature. And what you can see is that the day of the year when they're in full flower has been pulled forward by about 20 days over the course of the last 1,200 years, meaning that it's warmer earlier in the year. The time when they hit that temperature when they can bloom is there. I love this because it's a very deep data set. It's been very diligently collected. But then there's similar things like in India, for instance, where the companies that are in the Indian stock exchange, when they have their earnings calls, have to talk about all the kinds of material risks or opportunities that they're encountering as companies. And one of the things that has come up over the summer this year were mentions of extreme heat or heat wave in the company transcript. So when the chief executive is talking to his or her investors in the Indian stock exchange, they're saying, look, we have a material impact on our business from extreme heat. There's another factor that had come in from the Lancet, from a medical journal, that was looking at the number of hours of work that had been lost due to extreme heat over time. And, it's just like it was in the hundreds of billions of hours across the human population. I think these are useful and sort of relevant to just say, and I put them out in a sort of a no judgment way of saying, like, these are the impacts that we're feeling right now in people's experience and in their life, and also in their business, not just in saying, oh, it's hot today, but saying, look, we actually had a challenge to the way that we did our business in the last quarter because of extreme temperatures.
When we think about trends as well, I wanted to ask you about AI, DeepSeek as one example. I know, as someone who goes out and keynotes a lot about artificial intelligence, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what about all the energy use at data centers? What effect is that going to have? Can you talk a little bit about that for people who are concerned?
It's really fascinating. And I'm glad to be speaking about this with you, given that you do keynotes on this all the time. One of the things that we've seen, both of us in our careers looking at this, is that it's gone from being something that just sort of happened. I mean, companies have been doing artificial intelligence and research at machine learning and deep learning for quite some time. But now it's sort of elevated to the level of infrastructure, literally needing to go build billions of dollars, or really hundreds of billions of dollars a year at a time in order to support all of this activity. And it's a full stack of things. It's everything from building NVIDIA chips, which I think are very easy for people to understand and see, all the way to building new physical structures and then building the power infrastructure that goes into them, securing the land, securing the water that you need to cool all of these systems. And it's a real demand driver of both infrastructure in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere, but also a real driver of demand for electricity. So, in North America, we've not really had a lot of growth in demand. We've become more efficient over time. Our economies are not as heavily industrialized as they used to be. And so our demand has generally been trending down, but that's reversed pretty quickly in the last couple of years. The expectation is now that it's going to be growing, and growing in a way that it hadn't before. So this is why two things are really important. One, the capital investment announcements. Google just invested an expectation to do more than $70 billion worth of capital expenditure this year, most of which is going to go into data center infrastructure. And then to also look at things such as the DeepSeek model, which has similar characteristics in terms of performance as some of the foundation models that we see developed elsewhere, but uses much less energy in the training process. And so that kind of changes the narrative of like what amount of energy is needed to get the same kind of outcome. I think it's a great, healthy challenge for the sector to look at that. But I also think that it's not entirely clear that that changes exactly who's building what for now. It has the potential to leave us with a great deal of overcapacity in the long run. But at the same time, it's not like overcapacity doesn't get used. It just gets priced differently and utilized differently. If you go out and build a billion-dollar data center and you no longer need it for training models, then you might use it for what they call inference, for running models, and then providing that service at lower cost to all of the people that want to use the result of a model rather than train a model.
When we're speaking about DeepSeek, it seems like a good opportunity to bring up what's happening in China right now, because that's another noteworthy thing that was in your slides, that China is now the world's largest oil importer, but also the largest deployer of renewables. This might seem very confusing for a lot of people, so I would love if you could just unpack this.
I appreciate this, because China is kind of the biggest of everything that you encounter. It is by far the world's biggest emitter of carbon dioxide from industrial and economic activity. It is the biggest importer of oil. China now imports more oil than all of Europe. It is not the biggest consumer of natural gas, but one of the world's biggest importers. It is by far the world's biggest consumer of coal. And at the same time, it has by far the biggest deployment of renewable electricity. It has by far the world's biggest fleet of electric vehicles, and is increasingly a huge exporter of electric vehicles. It looks like its demand for some of its really, really heavily industrialized activities like steel production has already peaked, and therefore with that, a peak in emissions from steel making. It looks possible, I wouldn't want to call it completely, but it looks possible that its demand for oil has peaked as well. And so you have this fascinating condition where like it's the most of everything and the biggest of everything, but one of those sets of the ledger, one of those sides of the ledger rather, might be peaking in terms of its activity, and with it we could see potentially a peak in emissions in China. And it's not just that China is the biggest, but it's also been such a source of growth for all of these activities too. And if that changes, then that does have a change in the trajectory for everything. But I mean, China is pretty extraordinary. I live in Singapore, and we have great data on the vehicle market here. It's not a very big market. It's about 40-something thousand cars sold a year, because this is not that big of a place. But you can download the data from the government website and take a look at how many cars from which companies are being registered every year. And in December of 2021, BYD, the Chinese electric car maker, had 0.2% market share in Singapore. And in December 2024, it had 14.4% market share, which means it was second only to Toyota. So it had, in the course of a year, gone past all of the Germans, all of the Korean makers, and all of the Japanese makers except for one. And it's a great car. My building is full of them, and they're priced competitively. They're very new. They have fresh designs. They have great technology in terms of the battery and the powertrain, which is obviously one big concern, but also good technology in terms of the experience as a driver. And so these are factors and forces that we're going to see everywhere. I spent a lot of time, as you could see in the deck, talking about China's share of the auto market, and it's one thing that I keep going on and on and on about. China makes about 40% of the world's cars right now, which is pretty remarkable. For those of us in North America, we're actually somewhat insulated from it because of how integrated our markets are with each other and how much of our own demand we meet. But for the rest of the world, this is a huge challenge. I mean, when I go to other parts of Southeast Asia, I see ads for Chinese pickup trucks everywhere, and I see drivers in those pickup trucks as well.
So just a couple more questions for you, specifically around government. What is the role of our political leaders? How involved should they be right now? And are you optimistic about the role that they have in terms of change, or should we be looking more to industry? Just kind of talk us through that piece.
So I think that especially in North America, we live in this kind of comfortable fiction that markets determine, how our big complex systems work. But that's true in terms of a lot of elements of how transactions happen and capital flows. But every big market for anything that we use as a utility, whether that's electricity or water or telecommunications, or related things such as oil and gas and gasoline and petrol, are highly regulated because governments have an interest in getting them right. They have an interest in making sure that they're reliable, affordable, ideally, and widely available. So that's something that people, I think, can sort of, in North America in particular, think about as though the government has no role in that, but that's really not true. Then the government can also have a very big role in deciding where policy moves things, in deciding where we want to prioritize investment, what in addition to being reliable and inexpensive, we want our energy to be. I do think it's possible to sort of overload these with complications and things that the old energy world didn't need to think about, which is like what kind of hiring do you need to have? What kind of distributional effects do you need to have? Those can make things complicated and more political, I think, than might be ideal. But then there's also elements of government involved in how much dependence do we want on foreign sources, right? How much dependence do we want on foreign buyers? Similarly, these are flip sides of the same coin, and these are political decisions. They're also policy decisions. They're also security decisions, and so they can become really complicated. And there's not necessarily easy answers for them. And so my hope, in a sense, is that we all learn to communicate a little bit better about all of these things. In particular, in North America, we have the great benefit and the great good fortune of markets that generally work and systems that generally work. And so I think it can lull people into not necessarily making a lot of decisions, or not necessarily making a lot of conscious decisions about what needs to happen or where or why or by whom.
Is there anything within this 2025 report that you've done that you think is an indicator perhaps for a 2026 report? I'm not asking you to give me a prediction, but do you see where things are going in 2025? Is there something that's come out of that where you think, okay, this is a trend to watch?
I do want to watch very closely what happens in building for AI, which I don't actually have an answer to yet because I can't really see the prediction. As I said, Google's earnings just came. Google's projection for its capital expenditure just came out, and it's been raised by more than $15 billion a year. So certainly those companies are not seeing any immediate pullback in what they plan to do. I think it'd be very interesting to see on the margin what kind of decisions get made about where people decide to do their AI training and what that implies, and where people go when they do need to build. So in the United States, for instance, so much of the world's, not just the US, but the world's data center capacity is clustered in Northern Virginia for a bunch of reasons, some of which are historic, a lot of which are sort of convenience and infrastructural logistic reasons. where are they going to go next? Like you start to run out of space physically and metaphysically within Northern Virginia to do these things. Where are people going to go? You know, and when they move, what kind of decisions are they making in terms of who they partner with, who they build with, when those things are going to happen? And so that's something that I'm going to be watching very closely. Not a prediction, but on my radar, let's say.
Excellent. Well, listen, and thank you so much for spending so much time with me. It's great to see you after all these years. And thanks so much for joining me on the show. Thank
you, Amber. This was a treat. And thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nat. Amber, that was a super interesting conversation on the state of decarbonization. And I'll know we'll have lots more on that topic on the future.
Absolutely. Lots more on the future of climate and especially climate tech. Remember, you can check us out online at theambermacshow.com, and you can find videos across social media on my channels at AmberMac. And Jeff, I don't know if you are a Twitter convert just yet, but I know it's at Jeff MacArthur. Where's the best place for people to follow you?
Well, if you're following me on Twitter, you're going to hear some politics. And if you don't want to hear that, then you can follow me on Blue Sky, which I've decided to leave completely politics free as I try to move away from the stridentness of modern social media political conversations, which don't do any of us much good.
Sounds like a whole other segment for the future. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week. If you're looking for another way to stay on top of the latest tech news, I wanted to remind you that every Tuesday I send out a free email newsletter that will land in your inbox, and it's all about what's happening in technology and more. Each week we dive into what's happening in artificial intelligence. We also do a breakdown in terms of what you need to know about some of the latest threats online. We will dive into all of the apps that are trending online and tell you if they are safe to download, and lots more. We also do regular segments on climate tech and some fun stuff too for those people interested in how to lead on the tech front in a very fast future. Please join our community of 10,000 subscribers. All you have to do is head on over to my website. That's ambermac.com/newsletter, and you can join for free and sign up as we try to navigate our fast future better together.
You're listening to The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.